Hi, everyone. I'm Stan Mallow, the paranormal yacker. My guest in today's show is veteran UFO researcher, lecturer, experiencer, and author Preston Dennett. I'll be talking with him about his book, Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4. Preston Dennett, welcome to Paranormal Yacker.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks for having me back on. I really appreciate it.
As was the case with the 3 previous volumes of the Amazon UFO best-selling series, Not From Here, Volume 4 explores the little-known and more unusual aspects of the UFO phenomenon. Each chapter reveals strange and unique patterns of UFO contact. I'll be asking you about some of them. Here goes. Sometimes, Preston, UFOs chase cars down remote highways, and sometimes they go even further and lift them into the sky. Could you give me an example of a UFO car lift case?
This is a very unusual aspect of UFO behavior, which surprisingly is not that rare. There are well over 20, I would say, fairly well-known cases. Probably the most well-known, it certainly garnered international headlines when it happened, was a case that occurred in 1988, and this was in Australia, in a very remote area of Australia called the Nullarbor Plains. And for those of you from Australia, you know about this area, but for those who haven't heard of the Nullarbor Plains, this is very remote desert area. It's quite large. It's along the coast, the southern coast of Australia. Not a lot there. And the Knowles family, comprising of Faye Knowles, the mother, and her 3 young sons, well, not very young, they were pretty much adults. I think one was 18 to about 23. One evening, they're driving along the Nullarbor Plains, a few hundred miles, and they're pretty much in the center of this very, very remote area. There's nothing around. It's very late at night. One of the sons is driving, and this car passes them, and to their amazement, it's being followed by a UFO. A UFO is chasing this other car down the road, and they're all amazed. So they turn around, they quickly pull a U-turn, go to investigate, and sure enough, it is a UFO. It is chasing this car, but this is where the story takes a U-turn, actually. Because this other UFO stops following the first car, turns around and starts following the Knowles family. And they started to freak out. They pull another U-turn and race down the highway. And this object follows them. So they started driving even faster. In fact, the son, I forget his name, Keith, or don't quote me on that, he said he drove faster than he's ever driven before, upwards of 100 miles per hour. And this object easily kept up. Followed them, and finally it comes swooping down, and actually they believe land on top of their car, actually touching it. This is really unusual. I think it's the only case like it, certainly that I've heard, but it lifts the car up 6 feet off the road. At this point, the gentleman who's driving the car actually passes out. He loses consciousness. Faye and her other 2 sons who are in the back seat are screaming as this car is carried several hundred yards down the highway above the road. And after a few moments, it's set back down rather roughly. It actually popped a tire. They exited the car, and the object lifts up and goes to the front and starts waiting there. So they're freaking out. They exit the car and they run off to the side of the road and hide behind a bush, trying to figure out what to do. This object is just staying there. So they go back to the car. They quickly change the tire as fast as they can, not even bothering to retrieve the jack, and take off. And this object follows them all the way to civilization. It was basically an all-night-long encounter.
Each 4th of July, there is a huge spike in UFO reports. Is it fireworks that people are seeing and somehow mistaking for UFOs, or are they seeing really alien spacecrafts? If that's the case, what is the significance, if any, of them appearing on July 4th, the American holiday of independence?
I think there's some very significant takeaways from encounters like this. When I first started getting reports from people who said that they saw UFOs on the 4th of July, I immediately thought, well, they're seeing fireworks. I don't think there's any worse day to see a UFO, except I will say April 1st, it being April Fool's Day, would also be somewhat unfortunate to have an encounter on that day. But equally, yeah, 4th of July, I think people's immediate go-to would be, you are seeing fireworks. But after receiving a couple of reports, I decided I would look into it, because these reports were clearly not fireworks, the ones that I was receiving. And I received an incredible shock when I found out after going to some UFO databases like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, that this day, 4th of July, is the most common day ever in the entire year to see a UFO. And I decided, you know what? These databases receive 5, 10, sometimes 20 reports a day. But on the 4th of July, it was upwards of 50, 100 in some of these cases. And this goes back decades. So I decided I'm going to look at all of these reports, which turned out to really dry out my eyeballs. We're talking several thousand reports, and it was quite a difficult research project. Many of these 4th of July reports did match what we know of as sky lanterns or party lanterns, little candles surrounded by a paper balloon, which you can send aloft. These can reach about 4,000 feet in altitude, and from below, they look really impressive. They look like bright glowing orbs and can seem to hover in place or dart around quite quickly, move in formation, very much like a UFO. So I had to really discard a good portion of these 4th of July reports, which honestly could have been actual UFOs. But if they match the description of a party lantern, there's not a whole lot you can do with it. But there was a good number of reports of actual structured craft with portholes, even these little orb things, but moving in ways where they are too fast to be sky lantern. It turned out that yes, people are seeing craft on the 4th of July in very large numbers. And most of the witnesses who are reporting this, particularly the ones involving objects that are clearly not fireworks, certainly have the impression that these UFOs are coming to watch the fireworks. So that does seem to be one of the draws here. The ETs are watching the fireworks much like we do. It's a beautiful display. And speaking to that is the fact that many of these craft will show up when the fireworks show begins, stay for the entire duration, and then leave. These are, by and large, mostly simple sightings, but there are various categories of encounters, right? Close encounters of the first, second, third kind, and so forth. With the first being simple sightings, the second is encounters that affect the environment, third is actual contact. But there's a term that's been adopted called close encounters of the 5th kind, and that's when someone uses various techniques to basically initiate a UFO encounter or call one down. And thinking about it, I'm like, hey, these are all actually best categorized as close encounters of the 5th kind. It's our own actions that are in effect initiating these encounters. So that was my first thought, is okay, they're just coming down to watch the fireworks. Then I started thinking about it. I'm like, well, wait a second here, because there's a few cases. Looking at it, a lot of people are outside on the 4th of July. This is a really good opportunity to fulfill one of the agendas, which we as UFO researchers know ETs are following, which is to basically announce their presence, to let people know we are here. And if you have hundreds upon hundreds, well, let's face it, hundreds of thousands of people, millions outside on one particular evening each year, what better opportunity is there than the 4th of July to come down and announce their presence? So I think that might be another factor of what's going on here, because there are cases that speak to that. And one of my favorite involves a mother and her young son who were in their home, and they decided, they're going to set off little bottle rockets. And so she's standing by the door while her son is shooting off fireworks, and these little kind of V-shaped craft came swooping down. According to the witnesses, they were quite, not super large, but about the size of a small pickup truck. And so they stopped shooting off the fireworks and just watched these, and there was 5 or 10 of them, these little craft put on a display, which was far better than the fireworks. A number of witnesses have said this, like, wow, we thought the fireworks show was good. This was even better. And this is typical UFO display behavior, where they will release smaller craft. There's a few cases like that, or will move in ways that are really spectacular. And so they not only got to see their own little homemade fireworks show, they got to see a UFO display for about 15 minutes until, unfortunately, military aircraft showed up and chased the UFOs away. Yeah, the 4th of July, if you want to see a UFO, I would suggest, going out there and keeping a sharp eye out for activity that is not fireworks, because this absolutely is a thing.
One of the rarest types of UFO encounters on record is an actual collision with an unidentified flying object. Could you, Preston, give me an example of such an encounter?
There are many cases of near misses with UFOs and aircraft. As I was going through the literature, hearing about these near-miss cases, I thought, I wonder if there's any cases of actual contact where they, collide with each other. Because with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pilot sightings, I wondered about this. And it turns out there's almost none. I just want to underline that because there is no real danger here of a collision. That's certainly been raised by our government. But no, it's statistically insignificant. It's less than 0.001% of collisions. However, that said, I did find about 5 cases. One occurred in 1955 to Major Mervyn Stevens over Pixley, California, where his plane collided with an object. He said it was like hitting a brick wall. He's told reporters flat out, I was, quote, struck by a flying saucer. After speaking publicly, Edwards Air Force Base officials from the nearby Air Force Base did their best to cover it up, but there were outside witnesses. They weren't really able to successfully cover it up. And eventually there was an Air Force spokesman who did say, and I quote, it looked like something struck from above. So that is one case. And there are a few others, not a whole lot. There was one that occurred on July 28, 1994 over Mexico City, where a DC-9 was flying along, approaching the airport, when an object came up under the plane and actually struck the landing gear. This was revealed by an air traffic controller by the name of Enrique Kolbeck. He went public. He felt it was his duty. And according to him, there had been a number of reports before and after this encounter in the same area. Yeah, there are a number of cases like this. There was a very famous case which occurred on June 4, 2013, where a Chinese passenger jet was flying at about 26,000 feet when something struck the nose cone. And this would never have been made public if a passenger hadn't, upon exiting the plane, snapped a photograph of the damage to the nose cone, which you can see online. It's quite, well known, this case. I believe the official explanation was birds. I will say that there are some birds that can reach 26,000 feet. It's quite rare, but condors, vultures, even geese can reach that height. So that is absolutely a possibility of what happened here, but there was no indication in terms of residue left on the nose cone pointing towards that. So I did include that case. But here's where it's interesting, Stan. It's not just planes. It's planes, it's trains, it's automobiles, even boats, a couple of cases. There's one case involving a train, I should say. So not a whole lot in terms of trains. But on January 14, 2002, a train was traveling from Russell, Kansas to Shelbyana, Kansas. Their computers started acting up and going out. Sure enough, there was these 3 objects. 2 were quite high, but one was hovering above the tracks. And they tried to stop the train, but as you know, trains take a good distance to stop because we're talking quite a bit of mass here. They could not stop the train in time. For whatever reason, the saucer apparently did not realize that this train was coming, and it struck the train, damaged about 3 of the train cars. This incident was covered up, though one of the engineers on the train did go public and release this report. And as it turns out, there was an outside witness who didn't actually see the collision itself, but said he described a very similar looking object, if not the same, in that area at that time, on that same night. So while it's not direct corroboration or validation, it certainly does lend, I believe, some credence to this report. The most interesting cases to me were the cases involving automobiles. And I was surprised how many there were. And these usually involve smaller objects, orbs, I guess you might call them, or basketball-sized spheres. And there's quite a few of them. And these do involve vehicles that show actual damage. There was a case which occurred on December 28, 1954, over Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, where a vehicle came upon this glowing red orb and it struck the car, damaging the antenna and the chrome strip above the window. And there are, I will say, a few cases involving what appears to be humanoids as well. A really interesting case, which occurred to a gentleman by the name of David Morris. And this was on December 28, 1967. This was in Kent, Ohio. And he's driving home from work one evening and saw this weird glow off to the left side of the road where he knows there's no buildings or anything like this. And as he's driving along, he sees the source of the illumination. And it's this tall, kind of cylindrical looking object. And he's trying to identify it. He's thinking, what is this? Realizes it's a UFO. But at about this point, movement ahead of the road catches his eye. And he sees these short little figures dressed in jumpsuits crossing the road very deliberately, apparently not paying attention to oncoming traffic. And by the time he saw them, he was quite close to them. He slammed on his brakes, but not in time to stop him from actually striking one of them. And that really freaked him out. He came to a complete stop, jumped out of his car, and looked back. That's when he saw these were not human beings. This filled him with fear to the point where he ran back into his car and went straight home and just sat on his couch shaking, trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. He finally called his friend, who said, "We need to go back there and see if they're okay." And they did. They went back there. They found his skid marks. That was about all. They did find damage on his vehicle as well. Not bad damage, but the chrome was dented and scratched. And they ended up calling the police. And the report did make its way to UFO researchers at one point. It's a pretty famous case. And I've got about a dozen where people have had this experience. And some have multiple witnesses. There was one case involving 2 U-Haul truck drivers. Another case involving 2 people who were on a convoy, one car ahead of the other, and they all saw it. This sort of round metallic object pacing one of the cars came right toward it and struck it on the side, denting the car. So I'm not sure what exactly is going on here, but there are enough cases where I think they warrant a closer look.
UFOs are hovering over and landing at airports all over the world, and in several cases, humanoids are seen. You just mentioned some incidents where people saw humanoids at the airports. That interests me. Why is this happening?
Yeah, I would really like to know. I have a couple of theories. I got interested in this when I wrote UFOs over California, a book about California encounters. And as it turns out, Los Angeles International Airport has a long history of UFO sightings over a period of decades. And these are quite close up. July of 1952, over a period of 4 nights in a row, UFOs showed up very brazenly, obviously wanting to be seen. And it kept happening over the years. April 3rd, 1966, this oblong lighted object showed up again in 1973. This object was bobbing up and down around 77. In 1992, there was a major case. I've interviewed some witnesses personally who saw this. There was a huge case in 2002 and 2003. So I think there's enough to say that UFOs are certainly attracted to LAX. So I wrote about that in UFOs over California, but didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to it until I started hearing about other airport cases all over the world. And it wasn't until 2006 that an encounter over O'Hare Airport in Chicago really caught my attention. And this one did get international headlines because it involved a very large metallic saucer-shaped object hovering directly over one of the towers there. This was seen by quite a few people. This was on November 6, 2006. It was hovering over gate C-17. It was a 300-foot wide disc. It was seen by pilots in the air and passengers. Pilots on the ground, a bunch of baggage handlers saw it. They were the ones who kind of broke the story because they talked to a mainstream journalist. And he called up United Airlines, because they were employees for United Airlines, who denied any such incident. He called the FAA, and they denied it as well. But this object was actually photographed, allegedly. There are photographs out there. It went straight up through the clouds after about 15 minutes, leaving a huge hole, a punch hole in the very low cloud layer. So when this journalist started interviewing all these baggage handlers, he was able to basically force the United Airlines superiors to admit that this incident did in fact happen. The FAA was forced to release a statement, and this became a huge case, which was very nearly effectively covered up. Now we have all heard direct testimony from some of these baggage handlers. Photographs have been leaked out, though they're somewhat controversial. But this was the case that really made me look deep deeper into this. And I was shocked to find out that it's, again, not just sightings. There are several cases of these craft landing on these runways all over the world. There is not a location on this planet that hasn't had these types of encounters. England, France, Russia, South America, Canada, you name it. This is absolutely worldwide with these encounters. And it's not just landings, it's absolutely humanoids. There was a case in September of 1954 at an airport in the Azores, the Santa Maria airport, where an airport guard saw a 10-foot wide object land. A door opened and a 5'10" tall gentleman came out. He had blonde hair. I guess you would call it the typical human-looking ET. He approached the guard, actually reached out and touched him, patted him on the shoulder, just a very much greeting type gesture, returned to the disc and left. And there's a lot of cases like this. That same year, there was a case in Australia at the Bankstown airport in New South Wales, where a disc with portholes hovered over the airport and people could see figures inside. I mean, it was hovering right over the control tower. Lots of cases like this, and they go out through the decades, all the way up to the modern time. There was a case on October 6, 1965. I like this one because it does involve a landing. This was at the Concepcion Airport in Juan Pencia, Chile. A 90-foot disc landed. 3 figures came out. They were short. They were wearing what looked like divers suits, walked around the craft, kind of got themselves noticed, went back inside, and took off. This case is significant because it actually left marks on the runway. Landing traces are somewhat rare. There are hundreds of cases involving landing traces. One more case I think is worth mentioning because it's just a bizarre and interesting case. It occurred on August 26, 1967. This was in Venezuela at the Mayquita airport. Mayquisha? At any rate, the witness is a Marine officer, a good witness. His name is Esteban Cova. He exited the airport hangar and there was a disc and a 3-foot tall figure, which was not human. It had a big head, had huge bulging eyes, a hairy body, and it spoke telepathically to Esteban and said, "Won't you come with us? We need one more," which was so alarming to him, he actually fainted. And when he woke up a short time later, there was no more humanoid or disc or anything. After collecting these, some 30, 40 cases, I really started to wonder what's going on here. Because an airport, you would think, would be the last place a UFO would show up, because airports have radar. And some of these, by the way, have been caught on radar, have been photographed as well. I mean, there's a case of a UFO hovering right over LAX, which was photographed. So this is very much, again, the type of behavior that UFO researchers would call a display. So I have a couple of theories here that is what is happening. They're coming down to show themselves in a very undeniable way. That's one theory. Another theory is UFO researchers have known for a very long time that UFOs are very interested in our technological development. In previous volumes of the Not From Here series, I've written about this, such as rocket launches. There are many, many cases where UFOs will show up during a rocket launch. In fact, this is so weird. I have 3 cases in which people were launching toy rockets, little toy water rockets, bottle rockets, and UFOs showed up to investigate those. So this is how closely they are watching us. Jim and Coral Lorenzen, pioneering UFO researchers, learned long ago that this was a thing, and they said that whenever we're building a new Air Force base or a scientific installation or a power plant or what have you, UFOs would show up. And they got to the point where like, well, here's another installation being built. I bet you we're going to have a wave of sightings over these installations. And sure enough, it would happen. So that's another theory, is they're basically just keeping tabs of our technology. However, I do have a third theory, which is largely speculative, but having interviewed many, many contactees all over the world who are having direct contact, many of them get the message that at some point there will be open official contact. And many of them have visions or dreams or were told flat out that there's going to be a day when UFOs show up in very large numbers, and possibly even scoop people up if we should be facing an existential crisis, which we may very well be. So I'm wondering if this is sort of a practice run and UFOs are coming down all over the world at airports in case they should need to pick people up. And there are a number of cases where people have built UFO landing pads. There's a very famous place in San Luis Valley in Colorado where a lady built a sort of UFO watchtower in a little landing area. And shortly after building it, the UFOs showed up. In fact, Paul Hellyer, the very famous Minister of Defense, talked about this. He had his own personal sighting. He was also a person who commemorated a UFO landing pad in Canada. He became very vocal about UFOs, saying that we are being visited by numerous different races. There is, in fact, a cover-up. The ETs are friendly. But this is sort of another theory I have. This is why they are doing this over airports. It's sort of a practice run for open official contact.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Not From Here, Selected UFO Articles, Volume 4, how can they do that?
You can go to my website, prestondennett.weebly.com, and you can purchase it through the website. You can also contact me if you have a question or a comment or have a story to share. The books are available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other online retailers. I'm also all over social media if people want to reach out. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. I really appreciate you having me on the show, Stan. I think this is an important subject, and it's time people wake up.
Preston Dennett, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It's always a delight yakking with you.
Thank you. It's an honor and a delight for me as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my 3-part interview with Preston Dennett. In part 2, I'll be talking with him about the agendas of extraterrestrials, the oldest sightings of UFOs, and the superhuman abilities often given to UFO abductees by their abductors. So that you don't miss it, have access to past interviews, and be amongst the first to receive new interviews when released, be sure to subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, just press the subscribe button on your screen.